Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. We're really excited to be able to share with you 3 fantastic research projects that are researching refugeedom. So we've got a handful of great speakers from a variety of places. We just have a few housekeeping things to make you aware of. So please do use the chat to share questions and comments and say hello. And you're welcome to turn your camera on, but please do make sure you keep your mics off whilst people are presenting their talks. Of course, please be kind and respectful. If you have any issues or concerns, you are more than welcome to private message me using the Zoom chat function. And I will do my best to kind of address anything that might be occurring for you that are getting in the way of you enjoying this event. We are recording this session so that we can share it with other people who weren't able to join us live today. So as I said, please do keep yourself on mute, and Zoom only records active speakers anyway, so you don't need to worry about that. We will send all participants to this event a link to the video recording once available. And if you have any sort of general queries following this session, you are welcome to email the Sanctuary team here at Leicester at sanctuary@le.ac.uk. So, as I said, we've got a lovely range of people with us today. So please do feel free to say hello in the chat. We're always happy and welcome to sort of see the different people that we've got with us. So don't be shy and say hello in the chat. But we will hear 3 half-hour talks as part of this event today. So we will have Anya, Zaina and Osama, who will give our first talk. We will then have Alex, who will give our second talk. We're then going to have a brief 5-minute screen break because this is over an hour session. And then we'll finally have Miriam give a half-hour talk. We'll have an opportunity then at the end of those 3 talks to pull out some questions and address some of the things that are coming up in the chat. And then we'll hopefully wrap up around 11:45. But there is an opportunity to go over that slightly if there are quite a few questions coming up and people want to sort of have the opportunity to discuss these things a bit more. So without any further delay, I have the pleasure of introducing our first speakers. So Anya, Zaina and Osama, if you can introduce yourselves and talk to us about some of the great work that you're doing. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Anya, and I presented here last year. Thank you very much for inviting me back, Pascal. It was a great pleasure to be back with the findings. When I presented last year, I didn't think that my own family will become displaced as a result of Russian aggression on Ukraine. But we are 5 days into it, and most of my family is now not at home. So it's quite a meaningful moment for me to be talking about refugeedom. And I'm talking today with my 2 experts by experience who have taken full part in this research, and that's Zaina and Osama. Do you want to say hi, Zaina and Osama?
Yes. Sure. Okay, go on, Osama.
Thank you. So hi everyone. So my name is Osama Sharkia, and I work as a youth ambassador at Kent Refugee Action Network, which is a small organization that supports refugees and asylum seekers here in Kent. And also I'm a university student who's doing computer science at Christ Church University here in Canterbury. And up to you, Zaina.
Okay, so this is Zaina. I'm Zaina Juma. I'm intern at Voices Network. We are an organization, a small project funded by the British Red Cross. We raise awareness about refugees and asylum seekers in the UK. About myself, I'm a Syrian refugee. I'm a master's student doing additional learning needs at University of South Wales. Thank you.
Thank you so much, guys. And back to the research. So this research was about children who flee home alone and seek protection in UK. Next slide, please. So last time when I spoke last year, I mentioned some of the statistics, and we know that half of all refugees in the world are children, and only a very small, tiny fraction of those children reach UK. And even smaller fraction of those are children who fled alone without their caregivers. Next slide. I was interested in this research for many reasons. One of them was misrepresentation of refugees in general and unaccompanied children in particular by social media, and the discourses that rises in the community where these children are either welcomed and protected or feared and perceived as a threat to British borders. So this misrepresentation has led to violence, racism, maltreatment of these children. The children are also at a higher risk of mental health difficulties, particularly children who have seen war are at higher risk of post-traumatic stress disorder. Quite often when you do reach the safety of UK, you experience as someone waiting for asylum, you experience quite a significant amount of time, sometimes years of uncertainty in a legal limbo of not knowing the complexity of procedures, not knowing whether you would be sent back to the country of origin where you might die or whether you have a chance at safety here. Poor housing, very little money. These children do struggle and they do tend to hide their struggles because they're scared that if they share their struggles, they would be sent away from the UK, so they wouldn't ask for help. So the aim of this study was to try and understand how do they make sense of their experiences when they grow up, when they become adults. Next slide. You can ask me questions at the end, but it was quite an interesting research methodology where we used images to assist interviewing. We will also be sending a report at the end of this event, and you can read in a short report a bit more. But I'm happy to talk more about it later. We used IPA to analyze the data, and from the very beginning, Osama and Zaina took part in the data analysis once I transcribed the interviews. And at the end of the data analysis, I invited participants to a validation meeting where I checked that our understanding of their stories is the same as what they wanted to tell us. Next slide. The recruitment was really awful because of COVID. I contacted 113 charities and 3 charities only were able to take part. So we had 6 participants. 4 of them were from a charity in southeast of England. 1 was from East Anglia and 1 was from Midlands. We had 2 women and 4 men. Everybody was religious, 1 was Muslim and the rest were Christian. Next page. And the analysis yielded 4 themes: culture and religion, Kayan, discrimination, and building connections. Kayan is an Arabic for a mind without faith. And we will come back to this diagram, but for now, just bear in mind there are several conflicts. One is inside an individual of his or her faith versus their emotional suffering, and their emotional suffering is interpreted as losing faith. Therefore, if you suffer, you lose God. The other conflict is between the home culture and the UK culture, and the other conflict is inside UK, building connections versus discrimination. And now Osama will take you through 2 themes, and then Zaina will take you through the rest. Thank you.
Next slide, please. So starting with the first theme, which is culture and religion. So basically, religious people share many practices and beliefs that are combined in one overall cultural understanding in our countries. And the religion and faith are highly prioritized and offer hope and strength in times of suffering, as well as guidance about life. So communication with God, unwavering faith, and remembering the loved ones kept the participant going through the darkest time to reach the UK shores of safety. And this is divided into 4 sub-themes, starting with Hand of God. So in some of the participant cultures, God is the one who helped them through their journeys. Believing in God and praying during their journeys gave them strength and patience. And one important thing in their beliefs is the order from the God to leave their place to a safer place. And the second sub-theme is about appreciation. So living day by day is a part of the culture and religion, as well as learning from the past, but moving on from it and making the future better. And positive outlook and gratitude were very important for some of the participants. Even small things evoke deep gratitude. The third one is the promise to mom, or say promise to family. So in our culture, there is a strong responsibility for the parents and families. We have this sense of obligation and the duty to love and care for our parents and never abandon them. So building on that, most of participants describe how holding their loved ones inside them and in their hearts kept them going through their journeys, and all these risks are taken just for a better life for themselves and for their families. Then we have the keeping going. So the issue is girls are culturally considered as a weak spot in our culture in their families, so they are worried about and supported and not relied upon. So girls are never expected to leave their homes. Refugees girls who run away alone are despised for the decision they make, even if they flee home to find safety and better lives for their families. So the girls are sheltered from sleeping outside of their paternal house, even from a house of a close relative, such as their uncle, or therefore sleeping on the streets was particularly scary for participants. They had real courage to face the whole world in their journeys, but they challenged themselves and their culture. Next slide, please. And in this quote, as you see, from Jamal, it demonstrates the appreciation theme. So these simple words show his gratitude towards what he has now in comparison to what he had in the past. At the same time, we can see that he mentioned his family, which relate to the other theme, which is about promising to mom. And the issue here is showing in this quote that he accepted the reality of, to live without his parents. Next slide, please. So the next theme is about Kayan. So all participants described and understandable difficult feelings and thoughts associated with their experiences. So their expectations in the UK were not met, and this led to emotional suffering. So however, emotional suffering is culturally and religiously interpreted as Kayan. So thinking about things using the brain and therefore losing faith and giving up. And this is divided into sub-themes, starting with vanishing. So it's more about losing confidence during the journey or when having troubles, or having flashbacks, worrying, feeling anxious, missing families, experiencing trauma and stress, which kind of make them feel negative all the time. And the other sub-theme is here and there. So culture and religion is more to show satisfaction with what you have than thinking about how you can improve it. But when you have these doubts inside your head, you let your brain to dominate your feelings, and then therefore you kind of show this feeling of giving up and losing faith and letting the negative thoughts to dominate you. Next slide, please. And in this quote, it's noticeable that the culture difference between here in the UK and there in back home. So the way we usually socialize is totally different, and sometimes not understandable for myself and for the other refugees and seekers. And this sometimes evoke this feeling inside the people about losing faith and letting negative thoughts dominate them, and also to kind of look for the future without a hope. And next slide, please. So in this, we have this conflict inside the people, usually between God against Kayan. So feeling emotional suffering is seen as Kayan and feels like a conflict to faith. So losing faith, and in this quote, the participant described how he balanced despair with faith. It clearly shows this deep conflict inside him between losing faith and giving up, and having a huge hope from a religious perspective, and also looking for a better future. And I hand over to Zaina now.
Yes, thank you, Sama. So in terms of the theme of building connections, so building connections is really important for setting roots, feeling belonging, and breaking barriers. However, there are cultural differences, like English culture is completely different from the participants' backgrounds and cultures. Feeling belonging in the UK as well is also prohibited by the participants' culture and and religion. So we have here two sub-themes, communicating and telling stories. So in terms of communicating, the young people talked about making friends, finding a common language such as football, art, and learning English. Next slide, please. So, for example, here we have Noor, one of the participants. She shared how love and care of her foster cares helped her to connect. It was a small everyday acts of humanity. And in terms of telling stories, participants who had a charity to support them shared shared that telling their stories of other refugees helped them to feel validated and develop trust and belonging. Others have no charity with a community of refugees to support them in the UK. For example, we have one of the participants, he mentioned that he was lost his connections. This is still paining him deeply. Next slide, please. Thank you. The discrimination, all the participants unfortunately shared the painful experiences of discrimination in the UK. All the participants as well of this study are discriminated as Black and ethnic minorities and as refugees. They were also more vulnerable arriving to the UK as children alone. Discrimination consists of two sub-themes, as you can see here in this slide. The names people call me, and the other try to understand. The names people call me, some participants shared experiences of direct racial hatred in the community, describing pain when it first happened of racism, which made them question themselves. For example, why me? Eventually, one of the participants, as was named Jamal, accepted racism as a norm of everyday life that happens to him and others outside of control. While Fatma mentioned, another participant mentioned hidden racism in her interview. Next slide, please. So here we have try to understand. We have here a quote from Samir, trying to understand why and his feelings as well. So most participants felt that the people would not be able to hurt refugees if they understood what it was like to be a refugee. For example, Pakat, one of the participants, described that self-education about refugees could help people to understand refugees, and understanding refugees at that time could make it harder for people to be cruel to refugees. For Samir, raising awareness about refugees had become a cause. He shared he wanted to be a mouth to my friends. Just that his quote was. By friends, he described refugees making the journeys. Next slide, please. Thank you. So discrimination against building connections. Participants worked hard on building trusting relationships with others, yet all the participants described experiencing discrimination. This seemed to lead to a realization that there were two realities in the UK, good and bad. Another participant described how this led to choose whom to trust. And here we have another quote from Noor, and she just explained what's the discrimination against her, against building connection meant to her. So back to you, Anya. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So just to mention, I forgot to mention in the beginning, all the names we use here are fake names. They're not real names of our participants. And also the short report distributed at the end of this event, it has a quotations for each of those sub-themes, so you can have a good feel of that. But we couldn't fit all of it today. Coming back to our conflicts, I was particularly struck by the conflict in the middle bit where it says God against Kayan. And that struck me as a clinician, because I thought if you experience faith is something that carries you through this most horrendous and dark moments of refugeedom, then when you experience emotional distress, that means that you are losing faith, you're losing something that helped you to survive. So suffering, emotional suffering, could be interpreted potentially as something that might be dangerous to your life, something that is deadly. So I have started using this in my formulation in clinical work to help me understand a little bit better and investigate and be more curious around that with people who are refugees who I work with clinically. It is also coming back to the research and away from clinical practice. This was the central internal conflict within the individuals. Now the bottom circle is about life in the UK and how all of the young people in this research invested a lot of themselves and their strengths into building connections, into learning English, playing football, doing art, attending charities, attending these events, talking to media, to raise awareness about themselves, about their stories, to help others, other refugees, and to feel belonging. All of that is against culture and religion in some way, because the culture and religion allows you, the culture and religion of participants, the countries of origin, it allows you to look for a better life, but you shouldn't feel belonging. You should not feel like you belong in the UK because you're betraying your culture. At the same time, I cannot imagine not feeling belonging somewhere. So you're sort of stuck between that push and pull. Furthermore, with as many people who are welcoming refugees and helping these children and young adults, there is a lot of direct, indirect, hidden, overt, or by mistake, racism and discrimination, violent and non-violent, and the hatred. And I was quite struck by Jamal's words that he had to accept that that's normal, because there was no other way of dealing with it. He felt so powerless, and he blamed himself, and he was wondering why it's him. And it was, and he described us sitting there thinking, why me? Until he found the only way to cope with it was to say, okay, that is just something that has to happen because it just happens. That's how things are for me and others. And he said, the names people call me, I can't even name them because there are so many. So that that basically makes it really an everyday decision to keep going every day in the UK, even once you reach safety and once you have your immigration status and you are definitely safe and secure in the UK, you still have to make an everyday decision to keep going. And the other huge conflict, which I was also really struck by, is the girls should never leave home, and the girls are weak, and the girls are despised by their communities for having left home, even if they left their homes to seek safety for their moms and dads and brothers and sisters and themselves. And these girls, and I say girls because we're talking about children refugees, but of course it relates to all women refugees. But these girls in this study, they underwent not only what every refugee person undergoes, but also the threat and the real danger and the reality of rapes and particular discrimination of girls on the journey, through the journey, and a different attitude to them as somebody who is despised. In addition to that, they were also terrified to be leaving their homes alone because they never leave their home. But in their culture, they would not go to their uncles to sleep. So to sleep on the street was one of the worst experiences that the girls, some of the girls, described through their journey. And at the same time, they they are celebrated in the UK. So they are encouraged to continue with their careers, with their journeys of becoming their own person, of doing their own life, really. And that conflict, it doesn't disappear when you reach UK, it stays with you in the UK. And you sort of continue to make everyday decision that you are going to keep going. So when I was thinking about this, it reminded me of work by Bejan, who wrote about Afghani female writer. And that writer wrote about Outlandia, which is refugeedom. She was the first woman to leave, a first famous person, a woman to leave Afghanistan. And she described this journey of girls and women finding their freedom. She described that the refugeedom for them becomes more than just surviving and looking for a better life. It becomes a spiritual journey of attaining freedom. Next slide, please. So the recommendations from my research. First of all, I'm hoping that maybe it helps to develop intercultural competence. That is to say that people who are working with refugees from this particular countries of origin, regions of origin, have now a bit more understanding about what might be going on, how that's different or similar to the culture that we have in the UK. A big theme was about the unmet expectations. If you remember the Kayan, the suffering of the mind without the faith. So a lot of that was about the initial euphoria when you arrive to the UK and you're in safety, but then you are faced with the reality. You begin to learn English and then you realize that actually not everyone is friendly, not everyone is helpful, not everyone wants you here, and actually some people want to hurt you. So that and also the protection not been given straight away, the waiting, the difficult economic and practical situation. We've sort of put it under this unmet expectations, but there is a lot more to that. And if further research is needed, I looked at other research and there is evidence that there is not enough research into what are the needs that are not met, emotional, psychological, and practical, and what is the emotional impact of those. I would recommend, and I would do it myself in the future, I would use visual imagery in research and therapy. It helped to break the power dynamics. It helped to find the equal footing. Researcher and a refugee young person, it's a very different power dynamic. So having these images working together through a shared humanity really did make a difference in our ability to have a conversation on a level where we heard each other as human beings. And I use that in therapy. I use imagery, I use toys, and it just allows you to connect on a different level with another human being, which is something that one of the quotes with the necklace, if you remember the picture of the necklace, where the foster carer put down the fork and the knife and ate with her hands, and that connected the refugee girl with just being a human, just doing normal human things together. This research showed that it's important to help refugees practically to build connections and to particularly to find education that leads somewhere, because a lot of times it's really hard to know what you can study that will help you to have a meaningful career. So you end up doing learning English, doing a bit of course here and there, but you're not seeing where you're going with it. And it's really hard to navigate a system that you don't understand. So practically, refugee children and young people would appreciate that support. And as I mentioned earlier, I have started using this myself, and I would probably recommend others to consider using the information about internal conflicts and the cultural religious interpretation of emotional suffering in the therapeutic formulation. That's all. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. Just to say thank you, and to say that you can see the short report with the references and the quotes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anya, Zaina and Osama, for that really quite inspiring, but obviously quite difficult talk to listen to. Obviously, you know, for anyone who's involved in engagement work with people with, you know, different lived experiences, that might be very difficult. You know, I think we all appreciate that these things can be very difficult to capture, but it's important to try and do so. So I just want to thank you all in particular for sharing, at least for me, the first time I think I've ever sort of heard it articulated to quite a degree, the impact of that emotional struggle, internal struggle. And again, I think that it would be really, really helpful if, for people like myself who are kind of quite broad engagers, we kind of facilitate engagement between a lot of different groups of people, including people with different kinds of difficulties and lived experiences, and refugees and asylum seekers. I think that we could all do with you know, better information outlining how to appropriately, you know, engage with people around their experiences. So, you know, if that's something that, you know, might come out of some of the work that you're doing, you know, how to appropriately engage and help people build connections that don't necessarily kind of, you know, re-traumatize or bring up difficult experiences over and over again, which we know also is not helpful, then I can see that being actually quite powerful in sort of helping build those connections. So thank you so much again for that talk. If people do have questions that they would like to put to Anya and Osama and Zaina, then please feel free to use the chat. But for now, we're going to jump straight into our next talk, which is from Alex. So Alex, over to you, if you introduce yourself, and yeah, we'll hear about your fascinating research. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks, Marie. So first of all, thanks so much to Anya, Osama and Zaina for that brilliant presentation. And it was very interesting to me to listen to that, because there are so many points there that resonate with our research project as well. Speaking of which, my name is Alex Palanak, and I work at the University of Leicester Sanctuary Seekers Unit, which is part of the Centre for International Training and Education. And I teach ESOL and academic English. And for the past 7 years, I've been working with refugee background students and their teachers as part of our University of Sanctuary work. So this presentation today will outline a British Council ELTRA-funded interdisciplinary research project that I've been working on with colleagues from the Departments of Neuroscience, Psychology and Behaviour and the School of Education, in order to investigate how we might facilitate learning and well-being in the refugee language classroom. Next slide, please. So I'm going to cover the following points. So first of all, an introduction to the context, the challenge and the research questions of this study. And then I'll touch upon the research design. And then I'll go on to focus on the findings and recommendations, and then draw some conclusions from the research. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the big picture is that, so by the end of 2020, there were 82.4 million people worldwide who had been forcibly displaced, and that number is even bigger today. And so in their country of resettlement, the priorities are typically to be able to function in daily life, or to integrate or navigate services, making friends, building new networks, gaining employment, and also accessing education and training. And in order to do these things, they often need to improve their proficiency in the language of the resettlement country. Next slide, please. So, but there are some challenges in doing this, and so here they are in a nutshell. So we know that refugees tend to have a far greater mental health need than the general population, and there are much higher levels of depression and anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder. And we also know that PTSD has a direct detrimental effect on language learning. However, it has been found that many English language teachers don't feel able to support refugee background students adequately, largely because of these additional mental health needs. but very little research and practitioner training exists to help teachers to guide them in how to deal with this in terms of this particular focus, which is trauma-informed English language teaching for adult refugees, which facilitates both learning and well-being. Next slide, please. So my colleagues and I came together as an interdisciplinary team from the disciplines of applied linguistics, education and psychology to conduct research into this area. And just to say that interdisciplinarity was both a necessity and a strength of this research, as the focus lies at the intersection of different disciplines. So one discipline alone wouldn't be able to kind of wouldn't be able to do this research project justice, really. So the research questions were as follows. So we wanted to find out whether English language provision can actually facilitate psychological well-being, and if so, in what ways. And if it did, then we wanted to know what skills, strategies and resources could optimize these increases in psychosocial and linguistic well-being. And also we wanted to know what constituted good practice more generally in ELT provision for refugees on a more kind of institutional scale. Next slide, please. So in terms of what provision we were focusing on, we focused on the University of Leicester's English language provision, which was open to refugee students. So that included informal ESOL provision, which we run in conjunction with Leicester City of Sanctuary, and also our full-time academic English classes, our pre-sessional programme. In terms of who the study participants were, so we had 41 refugee background students take part in the questionnaire stage of the study, and then 6 of those students agreed to become case students, and they took part in the qualitative side of the study. So the ratio of male to female participants was 3:1. And in terms of status, about a third had refugee status, a third were claiming asylum, and a third had other immigration statuses. Under half of them had been in the UK for under a year. Okay, in terms of teacher participants, we had 6 teachers who taught refugee background students on a variety of provision. In terms of when this all happened, so the data collection phase took place between January and September 2020. So as you can imagine, it was affected by the pandemic, but I'll go into more details about that in a minute. The analysis and write-up we did that between October 2020 and December 2021. That took quite a long time. That was very much impacted by the pandemic as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I mentioned a minute ago, so we were an interdisciplinary research team, and this translated into the methodological framework that we used, which was also interdisciplinary. So we took we used a lesson study framework from education. We used Oxford's strategic self-regulation model of language learning from applied linguistics, and we used referencing as 6 dimensions of psychological well-being from psychology. And actually, you can see that particular model just here, and I will come back to that in a moment. Next slide, please. So I can see a typo on that slide, sorry. So the research design was mixed methods. So phase 1 was quantitative, and that was student questionnaires. Each questionnaire was divided into 3 sections. So part 1 was really to find out about demographics and background. Part 2 was focusing on refugee background students' experiences and feelings in their English classes. And so that was designed around Oxford's strategic self-regulation model of language learning. So that provides a framework of strategies and meta-strategies in cognitive, affective and sociocultural interactive dimensions. So that was how we kind of framed that as part of the questionnaire. And we also used the Harvard Trauma Questionnaire 5 Part 4 in order to adapt that questionnaire. And part 3, how do you feel about yourself now? So in this part of the questionnaire, students had the opportunity to self-report changes in levels of functioning and psychological well-being since leaving their home country. So this is a really useful tool. We based it on Joseph et al.'s psychological well-being post-traumatic changes questionnaire, and it allowed us to work out whether students felt that their level of well-being had increased or decreased since leaving their home country. So it could capture PTSD, but also potential post-traumatic growth within the same tool. And that tool was based around Riff and Singer's 6 dimensions of psychological well-being. Next slide, please. So phase 2 was a qualitative phase. For this part, we gave some training to the 6 tutor participants. So the training included trauma training workshops. You can see an example of one of the slides just here, and also a lesson study orientation workshop. So for the lesson study orientation, basically the tutors had some input into what the lesson study approach was. And so in lesson study approach, tutors plan a research lesson together, and then they teach and observe the research lesson, focusing on typically between 1 and 3 case students. So they get a really in-depth insight into how the students are learning and what they're actually doing in the classroom, rather than focusing on the teacher and what the teacher's doing. And then they had lesson evaluation meetings afterwards. So those took place in pairs. And then phase 3 was also qualitative. So we had a tutor focus group. So this took place online because by this time the pandemic had kicked in. So yeah, in that focus group, tutors were talking about their experience of participating in the project. Like, for example, how useful did they find the training? How did it impact their practice? Okay, and then we also had student interviews. So 6 students volunteered to be kind of case students who we kind of analysed in more detail, and they agreed to take part in like in-depth interviews. So some of these took place over Zoom, some of them took place over the phone. Okay, great. Next slide, please. Okay, so moving on to findings and recommendations. So I'm going to relate these findings now to the research questions in turn. So basically, we found that in terms of research question 1, so can English language provision actually facilitate psychological well-being? So we found evidence to suggest that it could, and that it not only led to linguistic benefits, but also positive increases in psychological well-being. And we found that improvements in language level itself contributed to increased psychological well-being. Next slide, please. So in terms of linguistic benefits, so students saw improvements in both general English and academic English. So we found this in the questionnaires and also in the interview data. So you can see here some of the words of the students coming through. So your English improved in your class. I learned how can I communicate. General English helped me deal with life. And in terms of academic English, we got a lot of feedback about how the academic English courses were very valuable in their own right, very necessary, and they were very much appreciated as a means to kind of progress. One of the students called it an excellent course, saying it really prepared him well for the next step. Okay, next slide, please. So in terms of psychological well-being, so we looked for increases and decreases across the 6 dimensions of this psychological well-being model. And we found from the questionnaire data that actually across the cohort, there were both increases and decreases across all of these 6 dimensions. However, the increases outweighed decreases. And it was really interesting that the students themselves linked those increases to things that had happened in their English class, or the simple fact that they had improved their English. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to look at these 6 dimensions in a bit more detail now, one by one. So the first dimension is self-acceptance. So this is about holding positive attitudes towards oneself and one's past life. So yeah, all 6 case students demonstrated positive attitudes towards themselves, and this came out in lots of different ways, including positive attitudes about their English level increasing, increased confidence, independence, feeling more positive about themselves and their lives. So you can see here the first quote, "I feel confident, it's easy. I can do all these things now without help. It makes feel good for me." Okay, and also all students were able to identify areas for improvement as well. So they had that sort of self-awareness. However, a number of students expressed discomfort about thinking or talking about their past lives in class. This came out really strongly, actually. You can see that in the second quote. "It's not comfortable for me about my personality, about my life, what I did, what I was in my country. There's no way, if you talk about my personal life, there is no way I can feel comfortable." That came out really strongly also in the questionnaires. So the item from the questionnaire, which had the statement, "I'm happy to talk about my life in class," was the item that scored the lowest of all items. So that's something that really came out, and I'll mention it again in the recommendations. Next slide, please. Okay, so now environmental mastery. So this is an individual's ability to identify and take opportunities to control their environment, being active. So yeah, all 6 case students indicated that they felt that there were increases in their environmental mastery in one or more ways. And you can see that in the first quote here. So when I came to the UK, I couldn't go outside just myself. She was dependent on other people, but now she can go everywhere alone. So that's just an example of many of those sorts of quotes that we had from the students. So some students, but not all, were also able to use various meta strategies in their language learning, and we'll come back to that in a later slide, actually, for some examples. However, all 4 students on the pre-sessionals emphasised the importance of external factors which facilitated their access, such as fee waivers and extra support provided by staff, also knowledge of opportunities and accessing help when needed. So I think the important point here is that we shouldn't put the onus on students to be able to manipulate their environments. We also need to make those environments more accessible for students themselves. So it's not just the student, but the environment needs to change, basically. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, in terms of positive relations with others, so this is the ability to form warm, trusting interpersonal relationships. So the case students showed that they really highly valued opportunities to be and talk with others, to expand their social networks, especially people from other cultures, and to learn from peers, especially kind of mutual learning. Although one of the students struggled with this, but most of the students were very happy for this to be reciprocal. So you can see from the first quote here about learning about somebody's country, culture, religion, a chance to learn some to hear different perspectives. But in the questionnaire, the sociocultural interactive domain scored highest overall. So 88% of students said they feel welcome in their class, 90% said that they're happy to work with other students in class. So that was a really, really interesting and kind of welcome finding. Next slide, please. Okay, in terms of autonomy, so this is qualities of self-determination, independence, and being able to evaluate yourself by personal standards. So all of the case students indicated an increased sense of agency and independence in their daily lives. So this was partly due to improved English levels and partly an increased sense of belonging. And some of them used specific learning strategies and meta strategies from Oxford's S2R model. So, for example, seeking opportunities to practice English outside class, reframing challenges as opportunities, and actively generalizing strategies from the classroom into different areas of their lives. So you can see here this first quote from Munir. So we're learning that you can plan in advance. So before you start anything, you have to put your plan. So he was able to use that strategy of planning that he'd learned in the classroom and to apply it to his general life. But other students expressed that they needed ongoing support, like they struggled to use some of these strategies by themselves. So the second quote illustrates that. When I make a target, maybe it's going to be like a wrong decisions. When I be with, like in a group or with a teacher, their advice, maybe I will choose a good way to be, like to reach my goals as well. So they wanted to have peer support, teacher support to help them with their goal setting and their planning. And interestingly, in the student questionnaire, the cognitive and metacognitive domain scored lowest overall. So students struggled to check their work for mistakes, for example, and to plan how to improve their work next time. And actually, planning and goal setting is something that survivors of trauma tend to struggle with generally. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so purpose in life is the next dimension. So this is a clear sense that your life holds purpose and meaning, and it relates to goals and a sense of direction. So the 4K students all expressed the fact that they felt like they had more purpose and direction in life. They said that that being on the English language programs helped to keep them occupied, and one of them said that it helped him to stave off depression. You can see that in the first quote here. Yeah, okay, and yeah, also students were happy that they felt like they were on a progression pathway to university. So this is something that gave them purpose and direction. And actually, one student said that just being in close proximity to the university community, being on campus, having classes on campus, even though he wasn't on a degree program, but he was in language classes, he felt like that in itself kind of was inspiring, gave him hope, gave him vision. And that's shown in the second quote here. My life is going in the right direction. The sanctuary classes open your mind. You're near the high class of education. You see the teachers from university. You see the student going to study at university. It can give you more hope. Okay, and next slide, please. Okay, and the last dimension is personal growth. So this is striving to grow and expand as a person to develop your potential. So attending classes seems to have developed elements of growth mindset in many of the students. So this is the belief that abilities can be developed and they're not fixed. So 3 of the students saw challenge as a means to grow and learn, and 5 of them wished to improve themselves through learning from peers. So here you can see that Munir is saying that he challenges himself to achieve objectives, for example. However, an interesting thing that came out is 2 of the students in particular had a different attitude towards challenge and risks and making mistakes in teaching. So 2 of them were overly fixated on correctness, accuracy, and they said that they felt very stressed. So you can see this middle quote here. I can't find the true words. I couldn't feel myself relax. I want to speak fluently and correctly. And Mehmet here says that he has obsessive behavior when it comes to speaking. Next slide, please. Okay, so just rushing forward because I know that I'm probably running over time a bit. Now moving on to research question 2. So this is thinking about what skills, strategies and resources teachers might need in order to help students develop their language and psychological well-being. Okay, so these are the 3 areas which came out here. So supporting students to employ effective learning strategies, fostering supportive peer interaction, and sensitivity and responsiveness to needs. Next slide, please. So so many students really struggle to identify and employ effective learning strategies, so they ask for extra support with these, as we saw earlier. So in terms of recommendations, so explicitly teaching useful strategies and meta strategies in the cognitive, affective and socio-cultural interactive domains would be a good way forward here. Also fostering a growth mindset, especially for students who might be anxious about spoken accuracy and fluency. So making it clear to students that, that mistakes are a natural part of language learning and that it's okay to take risks and put yourself out there. Also encouraging peer support with metacognitive tasks. So that relates to Murphy and Arrow's concept of near peer role models. So getting perhaps previous cohorts of students who might have succeeded in their learning and have moved on to other things to come in perhaps and share what strategies they used in order to succeed. Next slide, please. Okay, so the next thing is fostering supportive relationships and interactions in class. So providing opportunities for speaking practice will help with this. Also helping students to build trusting relationships, which is crucial to effective language learning. So, for example, Stone said that students need to feel listened to and valued and safe enough to take risks and make mistakes, particularly in language learning. Also to encourage students to support each other's learning in and outside of class. This is a lovely quote here from Farid, saying that he feels so comfortable with his teachers. He feels like he wants to speak all day because they're really listening to him. Next slide, please. Okay, so the third thing is the need for awareness or sensitivity or responsiveness to students' needs, and that links to Lambrecht's concept of super disadvantage. We know that refugee background students have got a variety of complex needs that kind of intersect with each other. Teachers need to be aware of these. So they need to gain an in-depth understanding of these needs and how to support them. Also, they need to be able to be prompt in responding to them, to be flexible, particularly when it comes to safety needs and also personalisation. So as we saw before, actually many refugee students actually feel very uncomfortable when they're put on the spot to talk about themselves or their past lives. So not forcing personalisation is a key thing that we need to be aware of as language teachers. And we need to address needs with sensitivity. So you can see from this last quote here, I wouldn't prefer anything different from other students because it makes different you from others. So although we want to meet refugee background students' needs, we don't want them to be seen to be treated differently from other students because it can make people self-conscious. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of research question 3, so here we focus more on institution-wide strategies. So we know that refugee background students' teachers need to have more support, and that we need to optimise institution-level systems and support, and also we want wider wraparound support before and during their studies. Next slide, please. So just very quickly, so in terms of supporting teachers, so the tutors found the trauma training and the lesson study process very helpful, but they said that they would like more of the same, really, in order to to help them to increase their knowledge of what is needed, but also to be able to talk to others in a supportive peer network about that. Next slide, please. Institution level systems and support. So what's important here is for the provision to be joined up and for there to be range, choice and a real progression opportunity. So it's for informal and formal provision to actually join up to create an actual progression pathway, and that the information about these opportunities needs to be clearly communicated to students. Next slide, please. Okay, and the final point for research question 3 is so there is a need for additional support for refugee background students to access provision to learn effectively. So that can come in the form of so resources to access the classes themselves, like fee waivers, additional financial support like travel costs, and also further support during the pandemic in terms of possibly digital devices or Wi-Fi access. Also other practical support. So these things came out strongly, potential psychological support, accommodation for people who might have lost their homes, addressing safety concerns, for example. But also in order to do these things, it's important to build networks and to tap into not only wider university services such as welfare and accommodation, but also external partnerships such as Refugeedom and City of Sanctuary. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is basically just a kind of overall summary of what we found. So basically, if we want English language classes to optimize psychological well-being, we need to meet psychosocial needs of students. So these include things like safety, a sense of purpose, feeling valued. In order to do that, we need to use some of these useful strategies, such as overtly teaching language learning strategies, not forcing personalization, reframing errors as something that is necessary and a natural part of language learning and not something to be afraid of. And for teachers to use those strategies, it's useful for them to have these qualities and skills, for example, sensitivity, empathy, awareness and anticipation of needs. And for those things to happen, it's useful to have these resources and systems in place to support for teachers, a means of ascertaining the needs of refugee background students, provision which is joined up, clearly communicated, for example, and the wraparound support such as finance, laptops, psychological support. So that's basically the overview of what we found. Next slide, please. Yeah, and what I'd like to say next is just that we would really like to say thank you so much to everyone who made this research study possible, especially the refugee background students who really generously shared their time and their experiences with us for the benefit of future students. And we do hope that what we found here will help future students and teachers. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Alex. Another absolutely fascinating talk. We are due to take a 5-minute break. There was a question that came up in the chat. I do feel that you've probably addressed the question already. So if it's okay, Alison, because you've put the question there, we'll come back to that at the end of our talks, if that's okay. So we can have a nice, clean 5-minute break now and rejoin at 11:10 for our final talk and an opportunity for some questions. So see you in 5 minutes. Okay, so welcome back, everyone. Hopefully that was just enough time for you to have a quick stretch of the legs and grab yourself a drink. We have one final speaker to share with you today. So our next speaker is Miriam. So over to you, Miriam, to introduce yourself and tell us about your research.
Hi everyone. Thank you for staying on. My name is Miriam Foto. I'm a lecturer of international relations at the University of Leicester. I would like to also thank Anya, Zama, Zainab, but also Alex. That was really interesting. I don't do a lot of work with refugees, so perhaps I'm the odd one out. I'm a political theorist, and today I will be talking about another figure in the border crossing that does affect the lives and the way asylum seekers and refugees are treated. So in a way it is relevant, but unfortunately I don't share lived experiences of refugees. So my own research is on ethics, so political philosophy on ethics of hospitality and migration. But in the last few years, I'm working around issues of smuggling, migrant and refugee smuggling, and how the criminalization of smuggling has affected the life of refugees. So if we can move to the next slide, just a bit of background. The smuggling of refugees and migrants across borders and between continents is presented today as a truly global concern. We have anti-smuggling legal frameworks that were created at the beginning of this century, first by the UN, but also we see at the EU level, and of course different countries have their own laws as well. The UN Office on Drugs and Organized Crime starts this idea of creating what we have now, we call the Palermo Protocol against smuggling. So in it and in other traditional representations of movements of refugees and migrants, smuggling is considered to affect a large number of countries as origin, transit, or destination points, while at the same time it is purposed to fuel corruption and criminality. And according to this narrative, smuggling is run by well-established networks of organized crime that make huge profits. Most importantly, smuggling of refugees is argued to put prospective asylum seekers and refugees' lives in peril. We see that in the media a lot. Media, states, international organization consider smugglers as profit-seeking criminals and ask for better national legislations and harsher international policing to deal with them. If we could move to the next slide, please. So we see that the public discourse suffers from this dichotomy. Sorry, it's the time where my chair goes down. Okay, sorry. So on one hand, we have the brutality of smuggling networks versus the vulnerability of unfortunate asylum seekers and migrants. And we see that a lot, this dichotomy playing a lot in the media. And this is an interesting narrative because it is true to some extent, but it is a narrative that consistently ignores the role and responsibility of states, the role of the border control regimes in shaping transnational refugee and migrant smuggling practices, and how individual and collective strategies toward mobility, so the strategies that asylum seekers have to use, adapt and adjust under the increasing militarization of border control. So to put it simply, that smuggling is used because it's difficult to get to borders and cross them and make asylum requests. So what is also interesting is that this public discourse is filled with accounts of organized crime, mafias, and unlimited profits that in a way are ineffective portrayals of the lived experiences of migrants and refugees on the ground. So I'm not sure about the next slide. So yeah, although the brutality of some smuggling networks is well documented, in this presentation today, I argue that the current legal framework's view is unidimensional. It is marred with a variety of theoretical and practical misconceptions, and I will be exploring them in a minute, which criminalize border crossing for everyone, and also which aggravate the precarity of refugees and refugees' life, their suffering, while failing to really address effectively criminal acts within smuggling. What in essence I'm saying is that the vilification of refugee smuggling and the anti-smuggling legal frameworks is part and parcel of what we call in political theory crimmigration, so the criminalization of migration. The criminalization of border crossing, and it needs, I argue, to be urgently reconsidered. Notions of agency, coercion, victimization in the context of migrant and refugee smuggling, which are by definition really complex, are further obscured by this vilification. This vilification, I will argue later, is recent, and it self-servingly silences the issue of state and institutional responsibility in dealing with refugees and refugees flows, according to state international obligation. What is more, and I will finish with that, states use anti-smuggling frameworks to make the borders more difficult to arrive at and cross, deter crossing, border crossing, and punish humanitarian actions at the border. So at the end, I will argue that criminalization of refugee and migrant smuggling is unethical, ineffective, and unnecessary, and I will say a few things about that. And to do so, I examine how anti-migrant smuggling legislation has failed to yield results, how it has become a tool of deterrence and not of refugee protection, because it exposes the lives of refugees and asylum seekers to further risk, to violence, and sometimes even death, and how previously existing and well-established laws can address the variety of crimes committed during the smuggling act. And this is something I want to, it's not I'm dismissing the violence that exists, right? But what I'm saying is that we have laws to address that without the anti-smuggling frameworks that in essence make lives of refugees more difficult. Moving to the next slide. So if you can press again, because there are a few things here exactly. So when we discuss about who is a smuggler, we have a variety of issues. We have limited data and research. This is something that actually is better addressed after 2017 with more ethnographic research and people working on the ground. But still, it is we have a little problem with the data we have. Yeah, why is that? Because data on refugee smuggling, especially in Europe, and this is the place where I'm working as well, are only partially available. I mean, they are fragmented, as I said. There's a great divergence in the way different states collect this data. The manner they collect the data is very different in its case. In many cases, this data come from people that are arrested, which is a small percentage of the people actually doing the smuggling. In principle, these data are collected by national law enforcement, so police, the Coast Guard, border authorities, together with national court records. So these provide the primary source of information. Statistical analysis may also be found in the data of international organizations and European Union agencies such as Europol or Frontex, also data collected through surveys. So all these, the limitation behind all these lies in the fact that the findings are largely based on estimates, so derived from official statistics. So in a way, since we don't have the ability to fully comprehend the scale and dynamics of behind the crime, data is fragmented. What we have is like bad data in, bad data out. So a lot of the main shortcomings applicable to the former extent also here. Another problem when we define smuggling is that the link between border crossing and migrant smuggling is not as long established as it often appears to be in the way it is presented in the media. On the contrary, the connection between irregular migration, refugeedom, and border crossing and migrant smuggling as a violent and ruthless business is something which is relatively recent and was mainly established in Europe during the first major refugee crisis in the mid-1990s. Yeah? So up until then, refugee smuggling was neither punished nor treated as an important act of crime as it is today. And it's something we usually forget. And if you read the media, you don't realize it. It even had a positive connotation. If you think back, for instance, at the legacy of the heroic acts of smuggling Jews to safety during World War II, or the Kinder transport here in Britain, for instance. So it's quite interesting to see that back then the idea of getting people to safety was something of a heroic act. There was also no common policy to combat migrant smuggling, and that changes, as I said, around 2000. with the preparation of a proposal for a council on the framework decision of strengthening the penal framework from preventing the facilitation of unauthorized entry and residence. This is a mouthful. This is the title of the council that was the first round. The European Union member states joined forces to discuss smuggling. The same year, we have the adoption of the UN protocol and so on and so forth. Since then, we see European states increasingly investing considerable amounts of resources to counter smuggling and punish the offenders. Interestingly, these have the same goal, namely to curb border crossing as much as possible. So after that, we have in 2015 an adoption of a common action plan against smuggling. In 2016, Europe commitment to it reached new levels with deploying the NATO vessels in the Mediterranean to help crack down the criminal networks, but at the same time also literally stopping people from crossing in a militarized way. So in the next few slides, I'm looking very briefly at the main definition according to the UN, the EU, but also the US frameworks. And I would like to ask you all to see how this crime might be also a deterrence tool for asylum seekers or refugees, how it might deter people in need or under persecution to cross borders. So if we can move to the next slide, that would be great. So quickly here, you look at a variety of definitions. Here's the UN International Smuggling Protocol. It's about the procurement in order to obtain directly or indirectly a financial or other material benefit of the illegal entry of a person to a state party of which the person is not a national or a permanent resident. I think someone's waiting at the, yeah. So here's a very simple definition. Interestingly enough, no reference to humanitarian background. So what happens if, you know, the legal entry needs to be provided because of humanitarian reasons? Could we move to the next one? This is the EU, it's called the facilitation package. Again, similar definitions. We shouldn't forget that the majority of the European states also, you know, first follow the UN protocol before the facilitation package. Here we do have a reference to humanitarian reasons. It says prosecution may be waived if such an action is perpetrated for humanitarian reasons, but it is at the discretion of the state. And if we move to the next one, here is the US State Department. It doesn't have to do anything with Europe, but again, I want to show how, while we have commonalities here, for example, financial gain is not a problem. You know, it's not necessarily an element of the crime. So when you're taken to court as a smuggler, the fact that you have charged people to help them cross might not be an issue, again, depending on circumstances. So we see how these definitions have some commonalities, but also some inconsistencies, yeah? This, in combination with a lack of consistent data on smuggling that I mentioned earlier, further complicates the facts, yeah? There's little consensus across the national jurisdictions on the definition of migrant smuggling itself. At the scholarly level, the EU framework I just discussed in the previous slide has been rather critically received, both on account of legal ambiguity, and now we can move to the next slide. So financial gain, humanitarian reasons, these ambiguities are an issue because it diverges from the UN protocol standards. You know, this discussion about financial profit that I mentioned is also an issue. And also the non-binding nature of the humanitarian assistance clause. We see wide discretion given to EU member states. So, and we see this in practice. Austria, France, Greece, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain, Switzerland, and the UK follow a broad definition and penalize the facilitation of entry irrespective of the financial gain involved. Germany and Belgium, on the other hand, need the element of financial gain as an additional requirement, yeah, and so on and so forth. I can spend some time to see different differences. The so-called humanitarian clause, for instance, absolving from criminal liability those who assist persons in distress, is only foreseen in the Greek and Spanish legislation for the time being. You know, things change overnight. The UK has transposed an analogous provision, but has restricted its scope to persons acting pro bono on behalf of a human rights organization. We see even wider disparities when it comes to criminalizing the facilitation of unauthorized stay, the type and severity of punishment. Also here we have a great variety of sentences. In Austria, Germany, and Spain, you can have a fine, from a fine to up to 2 years imprisonment. In the case of Greece, can be 10 years. In the case of the UK, can be 14 years. So the same crime is dealt in very, very different ways. So different sentences, different distinctions, and so on. Finally, the territorial scope of the definition also varies. Some European states sanction not only the facilitation of movement and stay in their own country, but also in other member states. But even there, the approaches differ. So Hungary, for instance, sanctioned only the facilitation of transit and stay in another member state. Italy, only entry and transit, and so on and so forth. I don't want to bore you. I know we've been here for almost an hour, so I want to make sure I'm being brief, but if you want to ask me more questions, I'm happy to expand. So the criticism here, and comes from many parts, but mostly from scholars, but also NGOs, is that these legal frameworks are vague and overbroad, yeah? So leaving a lot of discretion to states. And this is not accidental, but it's evidence of the fact that both prohibitions are in service of the same goal. Whether implicit or explicit, we can discuss that in detail, but the goal is to deter migration, to deter irregular border crossing, and this has, I argue, a great nefarious impact on bona fide refugees and asylum seekers at large. So it suppresses humanitarian acts to a great extent. And we see that in practice. And if I can have the next slide, we have many, many examples everywhere. And here I'm referring to the European continent, the UK, where people acting through, very well documented on humanitarian instincts being punished or taken to prison. So we had this, that was in the news here as well in 2015, this Danish couple. The woman is the head of the National Council for Children. Her husband met this family of Syrian refugees in South Denmark. So not border crossing, within the state, right? She calls the police to ask what she should do. They are given the green light, so they get this family in their car and they move them to Copenhagen. What happens? They are convicted as people smugglers. They actually appeal. This is a fine. I think there was a fine of £5,000. They appeal the sentence, citing a legal exception for providing humanitarian assistance. They insist they have not contravened the law since they have consulted the police in advance, right? And they had stayed within the country, so no border crossing. They end up with even a larger fine. So it's quite interesting. Obviously they were used as an example, but to deter people of doing something similar. But we see many cases where the law is used in interesting ways. Of course, the same in Greece. You have people reaching parts of the island in Lesbos. People reaching there, they have to go to the other part of the island to register their presence and start their asylum seeking procedure, but they're not allowed. So they are not provided with any way to get there. It's like 40 kilometers away. Greek drivers cannot give them a lift. They cannot give them a ride on the bus. Why? Because they can be fined under the anti-smuggling framework. This is quite interesting to see how it has been used in many ways. And of course, more important ways, I'm sure we have all followed how rescuers at sea have been in Italy and Greece charged with anti-smuggling charges. Yeah, and most of the time they're acquitted, but then they have already spent a year. I mean, in Greece it's more than a year in prison, and rescue missions have been shut down. You know, we see after 2018, for a year and a half, the majority of boats have, being moored and cannot act and save people. And of course, smuggling charges, and we see that in Australia, just to use another example from other part of the world, befall bona fide refugees themselves. You know, in many cases, people that have the know-how of smuggling, it's because they have tried many times. So they are refugees themselves. So 10 out of 16 people in between 2001 and 2006 in Australia were indeed refugees themselves. So it's quite interesting to look at this as well. If we can move forward, and I promise I will finish very soon. I now have, I have some time. No, I have some time. Okay. Here we have Chandran Kukatas from London School of Economics. He works on ethics, and he written this very short article in 2013 arguing something which is considered a bit radical or perhaps too aspirational. But what he says is that, of course, we have to recognize that there is violence happening, right? If you look at Libyan cases of smuggling, here smuggling moves into trafficking, we have violence. However, in theory, but also in practice, what do smugglers do? They do two things. First, they get people out of situations that are threatening. In the case of refugees, case of persecution. Yeah. So smuggling people beyond the reach of those threatening them. Secondly, they help people reach places where they can make application for the cases for asylum to be heard. So they take people to the law to a certain extent. Yeah. So these are the two things they do. Is there financial gain? There might be, yeah, because they do provide the service. So in a way, it's not always through a humanitarian instinct. It's some kind of service they provide. For him, smugglers do not do anything illegal. It is not illegal to transport people for money, and it is not illegal to arrive on the shores of a country, of a state, to seek help. Okay, it cannot be illegal to bring people before the law. And reaching the end of my argument, so before I do that, very quickly, it's quite interesting to see how in these representations, rarely the perception of migrants and refugees are taken into account. And we see, and it's quite interesting, and this becomes available in the last, let's say, 8-9 years, where we have more ethnographic research, where we see that refugees, asylum seekers, migrants themselves are a bit more nuanced, right? So for them, reliance on smuggling is a necessity. It's not, it's not some kind of luxury. You have to do it because it's very difficult to get to cross borders otherwise. A small number, actually, they mentioned that smugglers have been kind to them. In many cases, they say this is not the case. They have, been duped or taken for a ride. However, they do not differentiate between smugglers and state officials or border guards. For them, they are the same, more or less, actors that are profiting from their predicaments. And I mentioned how smugglers can be migrants or refugees themselves, but these depends on the cases, or they are people that have been proposed by family members or kin or tribes that have managed to cross successfully. So if we can move to the next slide, this victimization of refugees and migrants, that they are informed, that they are exploited, and they know what they're doing. Research suggests that it's a bit questionable, problematic empirically, but also morally questionable to think that, people that have spent all this money and they have spent all this time organizing their border crossing, they don't know what they're doing. Moving to the next slide, and I'm reaching the end of my presentation. I mentioned that I considered criminalization of smuggling as unethical. The reason I say that is because it compromises the ability of individuals, possible refugees, asylum seekers, to access protection. It has been proven that the criminalization of smugglers is making this access more difficult, but also it leads to an increase of violence, of even death, so lethality of crossings, to violations of human rights of migrants and refugees. And this obsession with smuggling betrays a lack of interest in the well-being of asylum seekers and migrants. And I think this is something that it's a conclusion that's easy to draw. Of course, one could say, well, how can you talk about lack of ethics when there is a crime committed? And what is this crime? And we can move to the next slide, is the border crossing, right? So all law breaking is unethical. However, and this is my philosophical aspect, background with talking, we can have this discussion about whether there are reasons, like content independent reasons, to obey all laws. What if a law is problematic? What happens when someone has to break the law in order to save their lives? Yeah. So is it the law breaking or the underlying conditions that matter? If we could move on. So what I'm arguing in the article, and I won't spend a lot of time on that, is that it's permissible under some circumstances because the harm caused by violating the law is not sufficiently grave to outweigh the potential benefit to those smugglers or others they assist. And this is a discussion around moral permissibility. The next part of my argument, the next slide, is that migrant smuggling isn't effective. It doesn't yield results. It's quite interesting. It's unsuccessful as law, both in the European continent or the other side of the Atlantic. So it doesn't reduce the flow of refugees because it doesn't have to do with smuggling. It has to do with push factors. It doesn't decrease the number of smugglers. On the contrary, the more this becomes a crime, the more it attracts real criminals. Yeah. And we see how practices of these laws have failed. The EU-Turkey deal, how it actually pushed, numbers went down for a bit, but then again up, that, closing or hardening the borders with Turkey means that the central Mediterranean route, has more traffic. We see that in the US and Mexico and so on. So not only it's unethical, but actually doesn't bear results. And finally, the next slide, it's unnecessary. We do have laws in place, both at the national, but also the international level for the crimes that may be committed during smuggling. So money laundering, extortion, contractual obligation, abandoning people at sea, yeah, or putting them on unseaworthy vessels, behaviors that are threatening, harmful, and so on and so forth. We have laws for that. So why do we need to criminalize migrant smuggling if it is proven to create more suffering and more death for asylum seekers and refugees? Perhaps decriminalization may incentivize an improvement in conditions for asylum seekers employing smugglers. Do I have a last slide where I'm thanking you? No, I don't. Well, thank you for listening to me, and I'm here for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miriam. Another absolutely fascinating talk there, and quite a different perspective being brought into these talks around refugeedom. So thank you so much. So we've reached the end of our talks. We do have an opportunity to ask just a couple of brief questions. Alex, I think you actually addressed this within the rest of your talk, but I just wanted to share a question that came up from Alison whilst you were speaking, who says a lot of asylum seekers attend ESOL classes where the teachers are not trained in trauma-informed approach. Could this be a problem? Should there be wider training for teachers both to avoid harm, but also to take advantage of the benefits from classes that you are outlining here? So I don't know if you just wanted to kind of quite quickly, respond to that.
Yeah, well, basically, yes to both questions. I think it could be a problem, and yeah, I think that that more training is definitely needed. This training could happen at kind of in initial teacher training courses, or it could be part of CPD. But I would say, though, that so I think many of the practices that we already tend to use as kind of ESOL or English language teachers are aligned already with trauma-informed practice. So things like making sure everyone feels comfortable, developing rapport, peer relationships, interaction, supporting each other, that sort of thing. I think many language teachers already tend to do that. And things like sensitive error correction, I think we do it as a matter of course. But I think there are certain areas where we really need to examine our practice and align it more with trauma-informed pedagogy. So one of those areas is the area of personalisation. I think as language teachers, we tend to be encouraged to get students to personalise language content. It tends to help with motivation, retention, things like that. But as we've seen, personalisation is a really big sort of sticking point for trauma survivors quite a lot of the time. So we need to really think about how we can find alternatives to this. We need to try and foster a sense of agency in our students by giving them choices, and to not make them feel forced into talking about themselves or their lives if they don't want to. So, for example, if we're talking about if we're covering the topic of family, for example, which is an important topic, people need to be able to talk about this. They need the vocabulary to be able to talk about this, for example, in Home Office interviews and to solicitors and things like that. So we could give them a choice about whether they talk about themselves or whether they talk about the family of somebody that they know, or maybe a famous family, or maybe a fictional family, so that there are always choices presented, and they're never forced to talk about themselves. So yeah,
Thank you.
That's the answer.
Thank you, Alex. And I think that's a really, really pertinent point that was made, particularly within your talk around, and again, sort of something that I kind of made reference to after Anya's talk around, the appropriate ways in which we engage with people, and, making sure that we're not, even with the best intentions, we're not in any way sort of, making that extra difficult for people with particularly difficult traumatic experiences, because quite often people make a point of saying, oh, we'll talk to you because of this lived experience, and actually, I think we need to sort of, generally speaking, gather a lot more awareness around, as people who are engagement facilitators, around, where actually, that's just not appropriate and actually not very helpful, even if you're trying to do the right thing and help people. So really great question from Marianne, my lovely colleague from the Edinburgh Arts Centre team, and a really practical question, actually. So I think we'll kind of take comments from our whole panel of speakers on this one. How can we make our spaces more accessible and welcoming for people affected by displacement? So should we come to Anya first?
Hi, sorry, what was the question, sorry?
Oh, sorry, Anya, I put you right on the spot then. How can we make our spaces more accessible and welcoming for people affected by displacement?
I think Osama and Zaina, I need your help. I think you have a lot more experience. Yep. All I can say from what I do clinically is I use toys, even with adult refugees. And I don't mean toys like Legos. I mean things like, I had one young man just on the cusp of becoming a young man, just after 18. And I used lots of different animal toys. And he just started communicating to me through those toys. He picked up each of the toys and said, many of these in his country, many of this and many of those in the country that he passed on his way. And in that way, I learned that he had experiences. He was unaccompanied. He came as an unaccompanied child to UK. And through these toys, he told me, without me ever asking, about his memories with his father, where he traveled on a camel through markets with his father every day. And he told me those things. And then he told me he saw people die because elephants stepped on their heads, or he saw people die from snake bites, without needing me to ask him this dramatic stuff. He was just finding a way to tell me things at his pace, without really feeling like he is being asked to remember these things on purpose, without being re-traumatized. But Dana and Osama, you have more experience outside of clinical room. Please tell.
Do you want me to start first, Osama? That's okay.
Yeah, absolutely fine.
Okay, thank you so much. I think raising awareness about refugees and asylum seekers all the time, it's really, really important just to bring the people together. The host community should know who live in their streets, who are these new people, who are these newcomers, what's the stories beyond these people, why they are here, and just keep raising this awareness in the social media and the community centers. And we have lots of organizations and charities in the UK. They are really playing a really effective role in this, in terms of raising awareness. Just to mention, we had a podcast project. It was a co-production project with the British Red Cross, and we were awarded as for the audio production award 2021 last November. It's a project from 6 episodes, and it's each episode talking about is really stories from. Oh, thank you, Jessica. Jessica just pop in the link for the podcast if you are interested to hear about it, to listen to it. And each episode it's talk about a particular thing about the refugees and asylum seekers in the UK. For example, we have accommodation, we have the loneliness, we have the home office, stucking with £5 per day. So we bring these people, real people from real stories, and put it on the public and let the people, okay, come on and listen. This is what we have this in 2022. We have people stuck with £5. We have people, they are ignored for a really long time without even any answer from the Home Office or from the MPs around. So the last thing that I want to mention, so tomorrow we have the first session. So to whom who live in Cardiff or the areas around. So this is this co-production project with the University of South Wales as a University of Sanctuary, between Voices and University and USW. So this project called Speak to Me, it aims to bring people who lived experience in the asylum process or refugee background with a citizen or a British people, a person, to speak to each other and support each other to belong, to practice English, and to communicate more and more in the community. So sorry for yeah, I will just pop in now to Salma.
Thank you, Zaina. I think that was amazing to mention all of that. So maybe for me, I could talk more about young refugee perspective. How would I see like a welcoming community, let's say? From my experience when I came to the UK, so basically I had like high expectations, and I was like really excited about education. And basically when we arrived, it wasn't that easy. I thought maybe in 1 year I can start university, but it wasn't that easy. So I had to go through like a lot of process and progress until I reached my university. So basically, I think many of other refugees have the same expectations about starting a new life, a good life here in the UK, and they kind of forget about the reality that we face here. So I think it's just like good to have people understand what does it mean a refugee, why they left their countries, why they are here in the UK, why they chose the UK, for example, and did they have a choice, for example. So I think basically it's just like to educate the people around us about refugees and asylum seekers, about their issues, about the concerns they have, and also about the isolation they have here, because mostly if they are young refugees and they are without their families, without their parents, and basically they just like have to rely on themselves to face all these circumstances. So I think, yeah, like Zena mentioned, this is more about raising awareness about refugees and asylum seekers will be like so useful, because people here in the UK kind of more like following the news, and the news, they are not always like talking in a positive way about us. So basically it's just we need to dig deeper, seeking for the truth and more about what is the reality, let's say. Yeah, I just wanted to add this from my perspective.
If I may sum up really quickly, I think the main point that you, Zaina, and Osama spoke about is raising awareness. So I understand it as a researcher, if you understand all of these things, if you do your own self-education and you understand what it's like for your fellow human being, you're going to naturally find practical ways of accommodating those people in your classrooms, I think, maybe.
Alex, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I was just about to make the same point, to basically to meet people as human beings and to work on kind of meeting people's human needs first and foremost before thinking about anything else. So for me, that's the best way to be welcoming. But in terms of being accessible, I think a point that I made earlier is that I think that we should make sure that we kind of examine our systems and structures that are in place. And I think we need to have a can-do attitude rather than just saying, oh, well, that's just how it is. We need to examine every aspect of our systems and structures in our institutions carefully. We need to think, okay, how do we need to change this? What can we do? And there tends to be a way. That's what we found. There tends to be a way if there's a will. We need to meet people's needs, financial needs, pastoral needs, and a lot of the time those needs can be met largely through multi-agency working. So just like I think, like for our project, for example, an interdisciplinary approach was necessary in order to kind of to really get to the crux of the issue. I think also in practical terms, multi-agency working has to be the way forward when working with people who have got very complex needs. So I think that's how we can make things more accessible.
Miriam, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add. I know you come from a different background.
I do. I mean, we do provide, for example, just to say something, in my department, we do provide some scholarships, for instance, for refugees who had students at the MA level. It was great, but, it doesn't help the way pandemic really was difficult, but even before, I think how the buildings are and the time allowed and all these financial and contract constraints is really depressing. I think the university, apart from doing talking the talk, they actually need to walk the walk and invest in that a bit more, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And for my part, I would say in terms of making them feel more welcome, just being warm and also not assuming they know what question they need to ask, because they usually come to you and they don't necessarily really know what they are here for or how to get to where they need to be. So you need to almost guide them with the questions and try to help them figure out what they can do, how they can get there, and try to accompany them throughout the journey, because it's really difficult to figure out. Okay, we had another question. I suppose that's probably more for Alex. Which is, how can English for All access the lectures for training mentors and volunteers? So I suppose on trauma-informed pedagogy and lesson planning.
So the trauma-informed pedagogy workshop is it's on YouTube somewhere. Although actually I'm planning to update it and to kind of re-record that one. So I'll make that one available hopefully in the next few weeks. The lesson study workshop, I'm not sure. I think what I'll need to do is consult with my colleague and see whether there is some sort of pre-recorded lesson study workshop that could possibly be shared with people. But we can let you know. Pascal, are we going to be emailing people with the link to this recording? So perhaps in that email, if I manage to find out about that, then we can add that to the email.
Yeah, and I would like to say in general on our behalf of the Sanctuary Seekers Unit, I mean, we are planning in the future to try and create more resources and looking at different ways of disseminating them. But yeah, we are currently looking at our plans for the future to try and do more, but in a more efficient way. So we're working on it. I don't think there are any other questions in the chat. So that's your last chance if there is anything more you'd like to ask. Okay, I think we've got something from Miriam. Miriam, loved your presentation. In my episode of the podcast, I explained how I was threatened by a smuggler. I'm curious that in your map, Venezuela is not there. Smugglers have been in the borders for ages, putting at risk Venezuelans' lives. Any thoughts on this?
It's not my map. I think that, no, but you're right, and it's interesting how, yeah, there's a trove of information that so slowly, you know, seeps in the actual official narratives. Thank you, Nilo. I would love to talk to you if you, I don't know, perhaps it's traumatizing and you don't feel like talking about it, but it would be interesting to, yeah, it's tough. It's tough to have this research get to the mainstream, and how it's interesting how the mainstream narratives are missing the point constantly.
Oh, there's a lot of text here.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So mine is telling us about their next exhibition at the Attenborough Art Centre at the University of Leicester, which is called In Which Language Do We Dream? So yeah, all very welcome to come to that exhibition. And then she's put a little bit more details. So it'll be from the 26th of March to the 5th of June, and a lot more detail, which I think I will probably put in the email back to all participants, but you can quickly click on the link in the chat box right now. And there is a last question from Frances. Miriam, how do you see a way forward to changing the approaches and attitudes of governments to their hostile policy towards refugees and asylum seekers? So quite a wide question, but an important one.
I don't know. I don't want to be a pessimist. I'm not a pessimist by character, but what I'm working on is securitization. So in essence, very quickly to say, is this idea in the last 25 years, especially in the European continent, where migration, which is a phenomenon that exists from the beginning of history of time, has become a security threat. You know, for years it was a humanitarian issue, but now it is a security threat, and it's dealt like a security threat. So by militarizing the borders, externalizing the borders, and so on and so forth. So the truth is, states should give up on that, right? And go back and look at it as a phenomenon. You know, it's not a problem to be dealt with, but somehow it needs to be accommodated. That means not using migration for political gains. Is this possible in the current situation? I don't know. But you know, look what happens. You know, happened in the last few days with Ukraine. Suddenly, you know, dealing with it. You know, with people escaping war. It's okay. It's a normal thing, and even conservative parties arguing in favor of it. So obviously, there is a way to do it. You just need to put the work in it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Miriam. Before we close the session, do any of the other panelists want to add to that in response to Frances' question? If not, I will just close the session. Thank you all very much for your wonderful contributions.